Tender is the Night, Book 2, Chapter 22, by F. Scott Fitzgerald. There were 5 people in the Quirinal bar after dinner. A high-class Italian fraile who sat on a stool, making persistent conversation against the bartender's bored, si. A light, snobbish Egyptian who was lonely, but chary of the woman, and the 2 Americans. Dick was always vividly conscious of his surroundings, while Collis Clay lived vaguely, the sharpest impressions dissolving upon a recording apparatus that had early atrophied. So the former talked, and the latter listened, like a man sitting in a breeze. Dick, worn away by the events of the afternoon, was taking it out on the inhabitants of Italy. He looked around the bar as if he had hoped an Italian had heard him and would resent his words. This afternoon I had tea with my sister-in-law at the Excelsior. We got the last table, and 2 men came up and looked around for a table and couldn't find one. So one of them came up to us and said, "Isn't this table reserved for the Princess Orsini?" And I said, "There was no sign on it." And he said, "But I think it's reserved for the Princess Orsini." I couldn't even answer him. What'd he do? He retired. Dick switched around in his chair. I don't like these people. The other day I left Rosemary for 2 minutes in front of a store, and an officer started walking up and down in front of her, tipping his hat. I don't know, said Collis after a moment. I'd rather be here than up in Paris with somebody picking your pocket every minute. He had been enjoying himself, and he held out against anything that threatened to dull his pleasure. I don't know, he persisted. I don't mind it here. Dick evoked the picture that the few days had imprinted on his mind, and stared at it. The walk toward the American Express past the odorous confectionaries of the Via Nazionale, through the foul tunnel up to the Spanish Steps, where his spirit soared before the flower stalls and the house where Keats had died. He cared only about people. He was scarcely conscious of places except for their weather. Until they had been invested with color by tangible events, Rome was the end of his dream of Rosemary. A bellboy came in and gave him a note. I did not go to the party, it said. I am in my room. We leave for Livorno early in the morning. Dick handed the note and a tip to the boy. Tell Miss Hoyt you couldn't find me. Turning to Collis, he suggested the bonboniere. They inspected the tart at the bar, granting her the minimum of interest exacted by her profession. And she stared back with bright boldness. They went through the deserted lobby, oppressed by draperies, holding Victorian dust in stuffy folds. And they nodded at the night concierge, who returned the gesture with the bitter servility peculiar to night servants. Then, in a taxi, they rode along cheerless streets through a dank November night. There were no women in the streets, only pale men with dark coats buttoned to the neck, who stood in groups beside shoulders of cold stone. My God, Dick sighed. What's the matter? I was thinking of that man this afternoon. This table is reserved for the Princess Orsini. Do you know what these old Roman families are? They're bandits. They're the ones who got possession of the temples and palaces after Rome went to pieces and preyed on the people. I like Rome, insisted Collis. Why don't you try the races? I don't like races. But all the women turn out. I know I wouldn't like anything here. I like France, where everybody thinks he's Napoleon. Down here, everybody thinks he's Christ. At the Bonboniere, they descended to a paneled cabaret, hopelessly impermanent amid the cold stone. A listless band played a tango. and a dozen couples covered the wide floor with those elaborate and dainty steps, so offensive to the American eye. A surplus of waiters precluded the stir and bustle that even a few busy men can create. Over the scene, as its form of animation, brooded an air of waiting for something, for the dance, the night, the balance of forces which kept it stable, to cease. It assured the impressionable guest that whatever he was seeking, he would not find it here. This was plain as plain to Dick. He looked around, hoping his eye would catch on something, so that spirit instead of imagination could carry on for an hour. But there was nothing, and after a moment he turned back to Collis. He had told Collis some of his current notions, and he was bored with his audience's short memory and lack of response. After half an hour of Collis, he felt a distinct lesion of his own vitality. They drank a bottle of Italian Mousseux, and Dick became pale and somewhat noisy. He called the orchestra leader over to their table. This was a Bahama Negro, conceited and unpleasant, and in a few minutes there was a row. "You asked me to sit down." "All right. And I gave you 50 lira, didn't I?" "All right, all right, all right." "All right. I gave you 50 lira, didn't I? Then you come up and ask me to put some more in the horn?" "You asked me to sit down, didn't you? Didn't you?" "I asked you to sit down, but I gave you 50 lira, didn't I?" All right, all right." The Negro got up sourly and went away, leaving Dick in a still more evil humor. But he saw a girl smiling at him from across the room, and immediately the pale Roman shapes around him descended into decent, humble perspective. She was a young English girl, with blonde hair and a healthy, pretty English face, and she smiled at him again with an invitation he understood, that denied the flesh even in the act of tendering it. "There's a quick trick, or else I don't know bridge," said Collis. Dick got up and walked to her across the room. "Won't you dance?" The middle-aged Englishman with whom she was sitting said almost apologetically, "I'm going out soon." Sobered by excitement, Dick danced. He found in the girl a suggestion of all the pleasant English things. The story of safe gardens ringed around by the sea was implicit in her bright voice, and as he leaned back to look at her, he meant what he said to her so sincerely that his voice trembled. When her current escort should leave, she promised to come and sit with him. The Englishman accepted her return with repeated apologies and smiles. Back at his table, Dick ordered another bottle of spumante. "She looks like somebody in the movies," he said. "I can't think who." He glanced impatiently over his shoulder. "Wonder what's keeping her." "I'd like to get in the movies," said Collis thoughtfully. "I'm supposed to go into my father's business, but it doesn't appeal to me much. Sit in an office in Birmingham for 20 years. His voice resisted the pressure of materialistic civilization. "Too good for it?" suggested Dick. "No, I don't mean that." "Yes, you do." "How do you know what I mean? Why don't you practice as a doctor if you like to work so much?" Dick had made them both wretched by this time, but simultaneously they had become vague with drink, and in a moment they forgot. Collis left, and they shook hands warmly. "Think it over," said Dick sagely. "Think what over?" "You know." It had been something about Collis going into his father's business, good sound advice. Clay walked off into space. Dick finished his bottle and then danced with the English girl again, conquering his unwilling body with bold revolutions and stern, determined marches down the floor. The most remarkable thing suddenly happened. He was dancing with the girl, the music stopped, and she had disappeared. "Have you seen her?" "Seen who?" The girl I was dancing with suddenly disappeared. Must be in the building. No, that's the ladies' room. He stood up by the bar. There were 2 other men there, but he could think of no way of starting a conversation. He could have told them all about Rome and the violent origins of the Colonna, Gaetani families, but he realized that, as a beginning, that would be somewhat abrupt. A row of Yensi dolls on the cigar counter fell suddenly to the floor. There was a subsequent confusion, and he had a sense of having been the cause of it. So he went back to the cabaret and drank a cup of black coffee. Collis was gone, and the English girl was gone, and there seemed nothing to do but go back to the hotel and lie down with his black heart. He paid his check and got his hat and coat. There was dirty water in the gutters between the rough cobblestones, a marshy vapor from the Campagna. A sweat of exhausted cultures tainted the morning air. A quartet of taxi drivers, their little eyes bobbing in dark pouches, surrounded him. One who leaned insistently in his face, he pushed harshly away. Quanto a Hotel Quirinal? 100 lire. $6. He shook his head and offered 30 lire, which was twice the daytime fare, but they shrugged their shoulders as one pair and moved off. 35 lire e mancie, he said firmly. 100 lire. He broke into English. To go half a mile. You'll take me for 40 lire. Oh, no. He was very tired. He pulled open the door of a cab and got in. Hotel Quirinal, he said to the driver, who stood obstinately outside the window. Wipe that sneer off your face and take me to the Quirinal. Ah, no. Dick got out. By the door of the Bonbonieri, someone was arguing with the taxi drivers, someone who now tried to explain their attitude to Dick. Again, one of the men pressed close, insisting and gesticulating, and Dick shoved him away. I want to go to the Quirinal Hotel. He says 100 lire, explained the interpreter. I understand. I'll give him 50 lire. Go on away. This last to the insistent man who had edged up once more. The man looked at him and spat contemptuously. The passionate impatience of the weak leaped up in Dick and clothed itself like a flash in violence, the honorable, the traditional resource of his land. He stepped forward and slapped the man's face. They surged about him, threatening, waving their arms, trying ineffectually to close in on him. With his back against the wall, Dick hit out clumsily, laughing a little, and for a few minutes the mock fight, an affair of foiled rushes and padded glancing blows, swayed back and forth in front of the door. Then Dick tripped and fell. He was hurt somewhere, but he struggled up again, wrestling in arms that suddenly broke apart. There was a new voice and a new argument, but he leaned against the wall, panting and furious at the indignity of his position. He saw there was no sympathy for him, but he was unable to believe that he was wrong. They were going to the police station and settle it there. His hat was retrieved and handed to him, and with someone holding his arm lightly, he strode around the corner with the taximan and entered a bare barrack where carabinieri lounged under a single dim light. At a desk sat a captain, to whom the officious individual who had stopped the battle spoke at length in Italian, at times pointing at Dick and letting himself be interrupted by the taximan, who delivered short bursts of invective and denunciation. The captain began to nod impatiently. He held up his hands, and the hydra-headed address, with a few parting exclamations, died away. Then he turned to Dick. Speak Italiano? He asked. No. Speak Français? Oui, said Dick, glowering. Alors, écoute, va à Quirinal. Espèce d'endormi. Écoute, vous êtes Saoul.
pariez ce que le chauffeur demande. Comprenez-vous?
Diver shook his head.
Non, j'en veux pas.
Comme?
Je parie 40 lire. C'est bien assez.
The captain stood up.
Écoute,
He cried portentously.
vous êtes Saoul. Vous avez battu le chauffeur. Comme ci, comme ça.
He struck the air excitedly with right hand and left.
C'est bon que chez vous, dans la liberté, payez ce qu'il a dit. 100 lire. Va au criminel.
Raging with humiliation, Dick stared back at him. All right. He turned blindly to the door before him. Leering and nodding was the man who had brought him to the police station. I'll go home, he shouted, but first I'll fix this baby. He walked past the staring carabinieri and up to the grinning face, hit it with a smashing left beside the jaw. The man dropped to the floor. For a moment, he stood over him in savage triumph. But even as a first pang of doubt shot through him, the world reeled. He was clubbed down, and fists and boots beat on him in a savage tattoo. He felt his nose break like a shingle, and his eyes jerk as if they had been snapped back on a rubber band into his head. A rib splintered under a stamping heel. Momentarily, he lost consciousness, regained it as he was raised to a sitting position, and his wrists jerked together with handcuffs. He struggled automatically. The plainclothes lieutenant, whom he had knocked down, stood dabbing his jaw with a handkerchief and looking into it for blood. He came over to Dick, poised himself, drew back his arm, and smashed him to the floor. When Dr. Diver lay quite still, a pail of water was sloshed over him. One of his eyes opened dimly as he was being dragged along by the wrists through a bloody haze, and he made out the human and ghastly face of one of the taxi drivers. Go to the Excelsior Hotel, he cried faintly. Tell Miss Warren. 200 lire, Miss Warren. 200 lire. Oh, you dirty, you God. Still, he was dragged along through the bloody haze, choking and sobbing, over vague, irregular surfaces into some small place where he was dropped upon a stone floor. The men went out. A door clanged. He was alone. Chapter 23. Until 1 o'clock, baby Warren lay in bed reading one of Marion Crawford's curiously inanimate Roman stories. Then she went to a window and looked down into the street. Across from the hotel, 2 carabinieri, grotesque in swaddling capes and harlequin hats, swung voluminously from this side and that, like mainslets coming out. And watching them, she thought of the guard's officer who had stared at her so intensely at lunch. He had possessed the arrogance of a tall member of a short race, with no obligation save to be tall. Had he come up to her and said, "Let's go along, you and I," she would have answered, "Why not?" At least it seemed so now, for she was still disembodied by an unfamiliar background. Her thoughts drifted back slowly through the guardsmen to the 2 carabinieri, to Dick. She got into bed and turned out the light. A little before 4, she was awakened by a brusque knocking. "Yes? What is it?" "It's a concierge, madame." She pulled on her kimono and faced him sleepily. "Your friend named Deaver, he's in trouble. He had trouble with the police, and they have him in the jail. He sent a taxi up to tell. The driver says he promised him 200 lire. He paused cautiously for this to be approved. The driver says Mr. Deaver in the bad trouble. He had a fight with the police and is terribly hurt." "I'll be right down." She dressed to the accompaniment of anxious heartbeats, and 10 minutes later stepped out of the elevator into the dark lobby. The chauffeur who brought the message was gone. The concierge held another one and told him the location of the jail. As they rode, the darkness lifted and thinned outside, and baby's nerves, scarcely awake, cringed faintly at the unstable balance between night and day. She began to race against the day. Sometimes on the broad avenue she gained, but whenever the thing that was pushing up paused for a moment, gusts of wind blew here and there impatiently, and the slow creep of light began once more. The cab went past a loud fountain, splashing in a voluminous shadow, turned into an alley so curved that the buildings were warped and strained following it, bumped and rattled over cobblestones, and stopped with a jerk where 2 sentry boxes were bright against a wall of green damp. Suddenly, from the violet darkness of an archway, came Dick's voice, shouting and screaming. "Are there any English? Are there any Americans? Are there any English? Are there any? Oh, my God, you dirty wops!" His voice died away, and she heard a dull sound of beating on the door. Then the voice began again. "Are there any Americans? Are there any English?" Following the voice, she ran through the arch into a court, whirled about in momentary confusion, and located the small guardroom whence the cries came. 2 carabinieri started to their feet, but baby brushed past them to the door of the cell. "Dick," she called, "what's the trouble?" "They've put out my eye," he cried. "They handcuffed me, and then they beat me, the goddamn..." Flashing around, baby took a step toward the 2 carabinieri. "What have you done to him?" she whispered so fiercely that they flinched before her gathering fury. "Non capisco inglesi." In French, she execrated them. Her wild, confident rage filled the room, enveloped them, until they shrank and wriggled from the garments of blame with which she invested them. "Do something! Do something!" "We can't do nothing till we are ordered." "Bene, bene, bene." Once more, baby let her passion scorch around them until they sweated out apologies for their impotence, looking at each other with the sense that something had, after all, gone terribly wrong. Baby went to the cell door, leaned against it, almost caressing it, as if that could make Dick feel her presence and power, and cried, "I'm going to the embassy. I'll be back." Throwing a last glance of infinite menace at the carabinieri, she ran out. She drove to the American embassy, where she paid off the taxi driver upon his insistence. It was still dark when she ran up the steps and pressed the bell. She had pressed it 3 times before a sleepy English porter opened the door. "I want to see someone," she said. "Anyone, but right away." "No one's awake, madam. We don't open until 9 o'clock. Impatiently, she waved the hour away. "This is important. A man, an American, has been terribly beaten. He's in an Italian jail." "No one's awake now. At 9 o'clock. I can't wait. They've put out a man's eye, my brother-in-law, and they won't let him out of jail. I must talk to someone. Can't you see? Are you crazy? Are you an idiot? You stand there with that look in your face." "I'm unable to do anything, madam." "You've got to wake someone up." She seized him by the shoulders and jerked him violently. "It's a matter of life and death. If you don't wake someone, a terrible thing will happen to you." "Kindly don't lay hands on me, madam." From above and behind the porter floated down a weary, Groton voice. "What is it there?" The porter answered with relief. "It's a lady, sir, and she has shook me." He had stepped back to speak, and baby pushed forward into the hall. On an upper landing, just aroused from sleep and wrapped in a white embroidered Persian robe, stood a singular young man. His face was of a monstrous and unnatural pink, vivid yet dead. Over his mouth was fastened what appeared to be a gag. When he saw baby, he moved his head back into a shadow. "What is it?" he repeated. Baby told him, in her agitation, edging forward to the stairs. In the course of her story, she realized that the gag was in reality a mustache bandage, and that the man's face was covered with pink cold cream. But the fact fitted quietly into the nightmare. The thing to do, she cried passionately, was for him to come to the jail with her at once and get Dick out. "It's a bad business," he said. "Yes," she agreed conciliatingly. Yes? This trying to fight the police. A note of personal affront crept into his voice. I'm afraid there's nothing to be done until 9 o'clock. Till 9 o'clock? She repeated aghast. But you can do something, certainly. You can come to the jail with me and see that they don't hurt him anymore. We aren't permitted to do anything like that. The consulate handles these things. The consulate will be open at 9. His face, constrained to impassivity by the binding strap, infuriated Baby. I can't wait until 9. My brother-in-law says they've put out his eye. He's seriously hurt. I have to get to him. I have to find a doctor. She let herself go and began to cry angrily as she talked, for she knew that he would respond to her agitation rather than her words. You've got to do something about this. It's your business to protect American citizens in trouble. But he was of the eastern seaboard and too hard for her. Shaking his head patiently at her failure to understand his position, he drew the Persian robe closer about him and came down a few steps. Write down the address of the consulate for this lady, he said to the porter, and look up Dr. Colazzo's address and telephone number, and write that down too. He turned to Baby with the expression of an exasperated Christ. My dear lady, the diplomatic corps represents the government of the United States to the government of Italy. It has nothing to do with the protection of citizens, except under specific instructions from the State Department. Your brother-in-law has broken the laws of this country and been put in jail, just as an Italian might be put in jail in New York. The only people who can let him go are the Italian courts, and if your brother-in-law has a case, you can get aid and advice from the consulate, which protects the rights of American citizens. The consulate is not open until 9 o'clock. Even if it were my brother, I couldn't do anything. Can you phone the consulate? She broke in. We can't interfere with the consulate when the consul gets there at 9. Can you give me his home address? After a fractional pause, the man shook his head. He took the memorandum from the porter and gave it to her. Now, I'll ask you to excuse me. He had maneuvered her to the door. For an instant, the violet dawn fell shrilly upon his pink mask and upon the linen sack that supported his mustache. Then Baby was standing on the front steps, alone. She had been in the embassy 10 minutes. The piazza whereon it faced was empty, save for an old man gathering cigarette butts with a spiked stick. Baby caught a taxi presently and went to the consulate, but there was no one there, save a trio of wretched women scrubbing the stairs. She could not make them understand that she wanted the consul's home address. In a sudden resurgence of anxiety, she rushed out and told the chauffeur to take her to the jail. He did not know where it was, but by the use of the words sempre dritt, dextra and sinistra, she maneuvered him to its approximate locality, where she dismounted and explored a labyrinth of familiar alleys. But the buildings in the alleys all looked alike. Emerging from one trail into the Piazza d'Espagna, she saw the American Express Company, and her heart lifted at the word American on the sign. There was a light in the window, and hurrying across the square, she tried the door, but it was locked, and inside the clock stood at 7. She thought of Cullis Clay. She remembered the name of his hotel, a stuffy villa sealed in red plush across from the Excelsior. The woman on duty at the office was not disposed to help her. She had no authority to disturb Mr. Clay and refused to let Miss Warren go up to his room alone. Convinced finally that this was not an affair of passion, she accompanied her. Collis lay naked upon his bed. He had come in tight, and awakening, it took him some moments to realize his nudity. He atoned for it by an excess of modesty. Taking his clothes into the bathroom, he dressed in haste, muttering to himself, "Gosh, she certainly must have got a good look at me." After some telephoning, he and Baby found the jail and went to it. The cell door was open, and Dick was slumped on a chair in the guardroom. The carabinieri had washed some of the blood from his face, brushed him, and set his hat concealingly upon his head. Baby stood in the doorway, trembling. "Mr. Clay will stay with you," she said. "I want to get the counsel and a doctor." "All right. Just stay quiet." be back." She drove to the consulate. It was after 8 now, and she was permitted to sit in the anteroom. Toward 9, the consul came in, and Baby, hysterical with impotence and exhaustion, repeated her story. The consul was disturbed. He warned her against getting into brawls in strange cities, but he was chiefly concerned that she should wait outside. With despair, she read in his elderly eye that he wanted to be mixed up as little as possible in this catastrophe. Waiting on his action, she passed the minutes by phoning a doctor to go to Dick. There were other people in the anteroom, and several were admitted to the consul's office. After half an hour, she chose the moment of someone's coming out and pushed past the secretary into the room. "This is outrageous! An American has been beaten half to death and thrown into prison, and you make no move to help." "Just a minute, missus. I've waited long enough. You come right down to the jail and get him out." "Mrs., we're people of considerable standing in America." Her mouth hardened as she continued. "If it wasn't for the scandal, I shall see that your indifference to this matter is reported in the proper quarter. If my brother-in-law were a British citizen, he would have been free hours ago. But you're more concerned with what the police will think than what you're here for." "Mrs., you put on your hat and come with me right away." The mention of his hat alarmed the consul, who began to clean his spectacles hurriedly and to ruffle his papers. This proved of no avail. The American woman, aroused, stood over him. The clean, sweeping, irrational temper that had broken the moral back of a race and made a nursery out of a continent was too much for him. He rang for the vice-consul. Baby had won. Dick sat in the sunshine that fell profusely through the guard-room window. Collis was with him and 2 carabinieri, and they were waiting for something to happen. With the narrowed vision of his one eye, Dick could see the carabinieri. They were Tuscan peasants with short upper lips, and he found it difficult to associate them with the brutality of last night. He sent one of them to fetch him a glass of beer. The beer made him lightheaded, and the episode was momentarily illumined by a ray of sardonic humor. Collis was under the impression that the English girl had something to do with the catastrophe, but Dick was sure she had disappeared long before it happened. Collis was still absorbed by the fact that Miss Warren had found him naked on his bed. Dick's rage had retreated into him a little, and he felt a vast criminal irresponsibility. What had happened to him was so awful that nothing could make any difference unless he could choke it to death, and as this was unlikely, he was hopeless. He would be a different person henceforward, and in his raw state, he had bizarre feelings of what the new self would be. The matter had about it the impersonal quality of an act of God. No mature Aryan is able to profit by humiliation. When he forgives, it has become part of his life. He has identified himself with the thing which has humiliated him, an upshot that in this case was impossible. When Collis spoke of retribution, Dick shook his head and was silent. A lieutenant of carabinieri, pressed, burnished, vital, came into the room like 3 men, and the guards jumped to attention. He seized the empty beer bottle and directed a stream of scolding at his men. The new spirit was in him, and the first thing was to get the beer bottle out of the guardroom. Dick looked at Collis and laughed. The vice-consul, an overworked young man named Swanson, arrived, and they started to the court. Collis and Swanson on either side of Dick, and the 2 carabinieri close behind. It was a yellow, hazy morning. The squares and arcades were crowded, and Dick, pulling his hat low over his head, walked fast, setting the pace, until one of the short-legged carabinieri ran alongside and protested. Swanson arranged matters. "I've disgraced you, haven't I?" said Dick jovially. "You're liable to get killed fighting Italians," replied Swanson sheepishly. "They'll probably let you go this time, but if you were an Italian, you'd get a couple of months in jail." "And how?" "Have you ever been in prison?" Swanson laughed. "I like 'em. announced Dick to Clay. "He's a very likable young man, and he gives people excellent advice, but I'll bet he's been to jail himself, probably spent weeks at a time in jail." Swanson laughed. "I mean, you want to be careful. You don't know how these people are." "Oh, I know how they are," broke out Dick irritably. "They're goddamn stinkers." He turned around to the carabinieri. "Did you get that?" "I'm leaving you here," Swanson said quickly. "I told your sister-in-law I would. Our lawyer will meet you upstairs in the courtroom. You want to be careful." "Goodbye." Dick shook hands politely. "Thank you very much. I feel you have a future." With another smile, Swanson hurried away, resuming his official expression of disapproval. Now they came into a courtyard on all four sides of which outer stairways mounted to the chambers above. As they crossed the flags, a groaning, hissing, booing sound went up from the loiterers in the courtyard, voices full of fury and scorn. Dick stared about. "What's that?" he demanded, aghast. One of the carabinieri spoke to a group of men, and the sound died away. They came into the courtroom. A shabby Italian lawyer from the consulate spoke at length to the judge, while Dick and Collis waited aside. Someone who knew English turned from the window that gave on the yard and explained the sound that had accompanied their passage through. A native of Frascati had raped and slain a 5-year-old child and was to be brought in that morning. The crowd had assumed it was Dick. In a few minutes, the lawyer told Dick that he was freed. The court considered him punished enough. "Enough!" Dick cried. "Punished for what?" "Come along," said Collis. "You can't do anything now." "But what did I do except get into a fight with some taxi men?" "They claim you went up to a detective as if you were going to shake hands with him and hit him." "That's not true. I told him I was going to hit him. I didn't know he was a detective." "You better go along," urged the lawyer. "Come along." Collis took his arm, and they descended the steps. "I want to make a speech," Dick cried. "I want to explain to these people how I raped a 5-year-old girl. Maybe I did." "Come along." Baby was waiting with the doctor in a taxicab. Dick did not want to look at her, and he disliked the doctor, whose stern manner revealed him as one of the least palpable of European types, the Latin moralist. Dick summed up his conception of the disaster, but no one had much to say. In his room, in the Quirinal, the doctor washed off the rest of the blood, and the oily sweat set his nose, his fractured ribs and fingers, disinfected the smaller wounds, and put a hopeful dressing on the eye. Dick asked for 1/4 of a grain of morphine, for he was still wide awake and full of nervous energy. With the morphine, he fell asleep. The doctor and Collis left, and Baby waited with him until a woman could arrive from the English nursing home. It had been a hard night, but she had the satisfaction of feeling that, whatever Dick's previous record was, they now possessed a moral superiority over him for as long as he proved of any use.